And I have the pleasure today to introduce our next two speakers. So the first of which is Professor Fiona Stanley, who I'm sure needs no introduction to all of you. When you read Fiona's bio, and I'm sure that's only a very small part of what Fiona has contributed, it's quite outstanding. And what I would really like to highlight in this brief introduction, she said, get on with it, is Fiona's commitment not only to science, but to activism and advocacy, and has always used her science in a way to promote and achieve better health outcomes for children and for the broader public. And since Fiona was the founding director of the Telethon Institute for Child Health Research in Perth, and since Fiona stepped down from that, she of course hasn't retired at all, and is now spending even more time on the advocacy side, and her commitment to climate change is really coming through very strongly. So I just want to again say, I'll say thanks to Fiona in advance, and then I'll say thanks to Fiona at the end. But it's a wonderful thing to have Fiona here, and she's going to talk to us about climate change and child health. So thank you, Fiona.
Linda, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Eugenie, thank you for that fantastic overview, and I'd also like to start by acknowledging that we're on the land of the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nation, and to acknowledge those spirits past and present. And if you haven't seen the ABC's First Footprints, get a copy of it and watch it. It's fantastic. I'm not a climate change expert. It really is important that you know that, but I am a passionate grandmother and an incredibly concerned citizen. And I hate people who come and give a talk and leave straight after it, like politicians usually do, but my grandchildren are calling me and I have to do that today. So I really apologise. I realise you've had a fantastic meeting, and I would have loved to have come yesterday and heard Ross Garnaut and Linda and everybody else. The thing about the Lancet, you can now sign up again to a new Healthy Planet manifesto, so I encourage you all to do that. A group of us, public health experts and editors of journals, did this before Copenhagen. We failed to raise the issue really of health at that time, but Lancet is a leader, and we've just all got to sign up to the latest thing, so just go into Lancet and sign up. I probably already have. The other thing that I am is on the ABC board, and I'd like you to, all of you, write to your liberal, conservative politicians and networks, if you've got any, and tell them we need an independent ABC, and that to cut it would be absolutely dreadful. And the other thing is that I'm ambassador for 350.org, which of course is about the divestment project, and I hear somebody's talking about that this afternoon, but to me that's a really important way to try and get companies to stop investing in fossil fuels. So what I'm going to talk about is climate change, but I'm not an expert on that, but I will make some comments about it. And then I'm going to talk to you about why an epidemiologist is so committed to the wicked problems and the causal pathways to wicked problems, and that prevention is really the only strategy. I'll then touch on climate change and child health and just plagiarise totally from Tony McMichael and Phil Landrigan, who are the two real experts on this. And then touch on it towards a civil society and mention the OECD Global Project, which I'm involved in. So climate change, I'm just take these out of the Australian, which of course is a climate change denying newspaper, and yet they put all of this in their newspaper. So you probably would have seen this a week or so ago, the climate change scenarios for Australia, the increasing the hottest years, the global fossil fuel emissions. Actually, this one is not from the Australian, this was actually from the same report that they quoted, I love this particular slide because it's really the extremes that we have to be concerned about in terms of climate, and I don't know how people can still be denying the science on this. So you can see here the increased atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations going up, and here's the sinks that are going down. And Nicola Stern just wrote in The Guardian on the 21st of February a very good article, very similar, I guess, to the sort of sense that Ross Garnaut probably talked to you about yesterday, that global warming will lead to conflict and war, and the risks are much greater than he realised when he wrote his 2006 review. And what my anguish is about all of this is that, and I've sat on Prime Minister's Science Council since Bob Hawke and resigned when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister because I realised it wasn't going anywhere. He took no notice of our recommendations. Tony McMichael and I gave a presentation, 20-minute presentation, to the Rudd Scientific Advisory Council on the health effects of climate change, and 2 weeks later he announced he was going to put everything on the back burner. So when an issue becomes political, the science is disregarded. In fact, what worries me now is that scientists are actually being devalued and somewhat made, we're almost a comic act, which worries me enormously. There's never a time when we needed more science rather than less, or to undervalue science. And of course, this is from the Climate Commission. This is it. A child born today, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about this, is right there, not only with more exposures, but with a lifetime of disadvantage due to climate change and its impacts. So this is absolutely key. And as I go off to my grandchildren this morning, you can be absolutely sure that I will not stop trying to make a difference, so we don't go on that horrible brown dirty path that's on this slide, but we go to this rather green, achievable, less increase in our climate change scenarios. Okay, so what does an epidemiologist do? Why am I so interested in these things? I've always been interested in why diseases happen rather than treating them. As someone said to me the other day, the biggest contribution I probably made was to stop doing clinical work. I'm very now interested in these wicked problems that are facing us as a society. A wicked problem is something that's complex, multidisciplinary, got complex causal pathways, and I always make the joke that for every complex problem there is a simple solution, and it is always wrong. So here we have all the complex problems that I'm particularly interested in terms of poor health and well-being, the social disease of child abuse and neglect, etc., behavioural problems and disengaged youth. And you can see right up there under the environment, climate change, environmental degradation, water resources, and new and emerging infections. But all of these things are wicked problems which require an understanding of causal pathways to solve them. Because when you think about things in causal pathways, you can think of multiple ways in which you can start intervening. You don't want to intervene right at the end, because then you're on an irreversible pathway to diabetes or to problems with children's health and well-being. You'd really like to start right up at the beginning. We may have missed that boat for some aspects of climate change, but we have to try and think about that. So this is an example. It's great to have Rosalie Schultz here. Rosalie, you did a study on this issue as a fourth-year medical student, and it's gorgeous to see you. I'm very proud of my students. They've just done so well. So, antenatal tobacco exposure, growth restriction, low birth weight, maternal smoking, overcrowding, otitis media, language delay, behaviour problems, educational... This is a pathway. And wouldn't it be great if we could stop it antenatally rather than trying to treat otitis media once it occurs? This is a pathway that's particularly relevant to Aboriginal children. And so it just gives you an example of my sort of thinking. So, okay, if we're talking about climate change and child health, then the guru, in my opinion, well, there are lots of gurus, but this is actually the indirect influences from McMichael's 2012 chapter, and how climate change, through all these different impacts, can affect human health. So it's a really good, I love these kind of spaghetti and meatballs diagrams that Barry Jones was totally criticised for, because it's the way I think too. And you've got to think like this, because these are complex problems. So climate change just doesn't affect us by the fact that we'll be more heat or less water or less rain and so on. It's going to affect us because of all these indirect things like food yields and biodiversity loss and sea level rise and so on. And so I hope you can see this particular, can you read this particular slide? And anyway, so there are two slides here which look at the relationship between environmental change, climate change, ecological change, and child health. So you look at environmental change, and these are the sorts of things that can particularly affect children. Now, I should actually say that in this paper, which was in Ambulatory Paediatrics in 2003, and there have been other papers since, but there isn't, they keep saying there's not got a lot of data on the relationship between climate change and child health. But actually, we've got enough data about from the environmental scientists, the environmental epidemiologists, to say that we can predict this with a certain degree of surety, the certainty, that if these things happen, then these impacts will occur on children. And this first slide talks about the signs of changes, the fact that the air pollution would cause cough and asthma and other respiratory problems if you've got more UV radiation. Big programs in our institute now looking at sunburn and malignant melanoma and immunosuppression. We've just got things with heat stroke. with weather disasters, more kids will drown, they'll be dehydrated, you know, they're more vulnerable, so we'll get more things. And the psychosocial trauma, I think, is going to be significant in kids who are already worried about these things and are going to be scared about it. And then all the things around food availability, and think globally on this one, not just in Australia, although the people who are going to be most affected are our most vulnerable populations, like the Aboriginal populations. Growth retardation and developmental delay. With allergens and mycotoxins that are likely to be increased, then there's going to be, again, allergies, cancers, and birth defects could rise as well. So all of these are known pathways, it's just we don't know the extent to which they will happen in terms of children's health and well-being. The infectious disease exposure, I think, is actually already happening in terms of things like dengue, and the emerging infectious disease is also happening. And that's something we're not going to be able to predict, and we've got to have an emergency response. When we first started lobbying Prime Minister's Science Council about this, there was absolutely, McMichael was telling me that there was no group or no centre within the Department of Health in Canberra that was dedicated to the health effects of climate change. And I don't know if there is or isn't, but that's something we should be lobbying for very strongly. We should be talking about mitigating and adapting and what health services are going to need to have funded to cope with some of this stuff. Now, this slide is a slide about why kids are so vulnerable. You know, that the aged die more when there's a heat wave. But because kids are poorly developed, so they're underdeveloped, that last bit there, they're underdeveloped, so that, of course, they're going to have more likely to have, you know, malnutrition effects and psychosocial trauma and so on. But they're likely to have a longer exposure because they're little, and so they've got a more lifetime of exposure. We know that early exposures in children lead to lifelong problems. In fact, it's one of our pathways. The whole DOHAD, the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease activities around the world, showing that early exposure has lifelong impacts. Because they have high respiratory rates, high metabolic rates, and higher demand for water, they're more likely to be exposed to these things and to take them on board. They're more likely to be outside, they're running around a lot, they don't obey you, particularly my grandchildren. I thought he was going to break his neck yesterday as he was doing a forward pike off the back of the lounge. So they're not going to say, you know, obey you when you say don't go outside there and don't eat that mycotoxin. Because they can't swim, they're going to be more likely to drown, and we've already had kids drowning in situations where there has been flooding. They've got a higher surface volume, whole surface area to the volume of their bodies, so they're much more likely to absorb things, and they have less ability to detoxify. Their skin is less developed, their immune system is less developed, and so on, so they're more likely to be adversely responding to these things. So, you know, when we talk about the vulnerability of children, we do have information on this. So whilst we don't have definitive information to say climate change will result in this much health and well-being problems in kids, I don't think we need that to act. We have enough information from the environmental epidemiologists to show this is going to be a major problem for our children. And the thing that really is keeping going over my mind is they're little now. They're going to have a longer exposure than we've had to these adverse events. And that's what's going to be so traumatic and so lifelong and so worrying. So the next couple of slides are things, Lynn Stansis has done this sort of work. Bob, you would know her work well from ANU. We're going to have a 3 to 15-fold increase in health risks by 2100. So this is why we really, and that's going to be incremental, we really do need to have health departments that are aware of this and budgeting for it. The social gradients in health will be greater, and we know that incredibly adverse effects of social inequity, and not just in health but in all the other things. The agricultural productivity, and this is what I want about you to think globally, about the millions of children in the global world who are going to be affected by this. Just as we're getting our act together, where's Rob Moody? Internationally, we're going to be hit by this. And of course, when you look at things like the political instability and war and conflict due to climate change, war is probably the most adverse impact affecting children's health and well-being internationally. So all the other things I've mentioned about the other diseases, but the natural disasters and the infectious diseases, the transmission, I think this is already starting to happen, and we're more likely to get serious epidemics, particularly amongst communities that haven't had them before. So we're going to be more susceptible. So I now want to touch upon what I consider the biggest causal pathway, if you like, the big issues. And this is where we've done a lot of work. And it's about a civil society. And so Clyde Hertzman, one of my dearest friends who dropped dead last year at the age of 57, was probably the world expert on early child development. We're witnesses to a dramatic expansion of market-based economies whose capacity for wealth generation is awesome in comparison to both the distant and the recent past. At the same time, there is a growing perception of substantial threats to the health and well-being of today's children and youth in the very societies that benefit most from this abundance. This is the real cause of why we've got climate change, is because of the greed of our international companies who all they want to do, according to Thatcher and Reagan, was to make a buck. And of course, if you just create wealth, we'll get the trickle-down effect. Well, I'm sorry, we're still waiting for the bloody trickle-down. So we did this slide quite some years ago when we wrote our book about a civil society and the things that we felt a civil society would focus on. We put the child right in the middle. Societies that put children in the middle are societies that are good for everybody. And you think of the things that are around that child, its family, the community and the school. But outside that are there either the disabling or the enabling aspects of that political, social, workplace, economic, dare I even say, spiritual aspects around that, which either disable or enable that. And an uncivil society, you can see over here, is one with inequalities, fear and violence, priorities for material wealth, etc., environmental degradation and so on. And on the other side is what we really do need to aspire to, that we go for preventions more than cures. We value parents, value children, protected environments, and that really means the climate change is an absolute top of that. So this is sort of my, if you like, my little mantra of why we've got this climate change issue, because we haven't been a civil society, we've been much more of an uncivil society. There is a New Yorker cartoon for everything. So, now this is Tony McMichael in the book on the 4-degree world, and the fact that we are now planning or being very concerned about a 4-degree world where you don't know in advance but it's such a compelling and scaring issue about the radical actions that we need to take in terms of long-term primary prevention. And as he says, not just tinkering with electorally timid adaptive policies and actions. And I'm sure that Ross would have mentioned that yesterday. The two oncoming generations, this is my grandchildren and their children, will live part of their lives in the late 21st century. What's it going to be like for them? And I think this is going to mean, is it going to be actually a livable habitat for humans? Now, one of the people who helped me with this talk is a person called Jamie Yallop, married to Brad Ferrant, and they're the two in the Institute who are running our whole climate change stuff. And I love it. This is on the bottom of her email. It's 3:23 in the morning and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the planet was plundered? What did you do when the earth was unravelling? Surely you did something when the Caesars started failing, as the mammals, reptiles and birds were all dying. This makes me feel quite emotional, actually. Did you fill the streets with protest when democracy was stolen? It's very relevant to Australia at the moment, I believe. I'm not trying to dramatise that. What did you do once you knew? So I just want to finish with this OECD global program that I'm associated with, and it's also related to the Australian National Development Index, which a group of us are trying to get up. And the whole of the OECD project is to develop alternatives to GDP as a measure of how we foster and measure the progress of societies. So the whole idea is to say GDP is a very flawed instrument and we can use other things. So when we had our last meeting in Delhi a year ago, I chaired the child wellbeing session. If we had measures of child wellbeing like the Australian Early Development Index, which has now gone national and is going internationally, would that be the way that governments wanted to then spend their money rather than on just getting an IMF acceptable GDP bottom line? And I love this quote from Robert Kennedy. Yet the GNP does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, I debate that now in America, but this was in 1968, or the integrity of our public officials, I'd also debate that in the US too. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything, I doubt that too, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it tells us everything about America except why we are proud that we are Americans. So the whole idea of the OECD project is to develop amongst a whole group of countries, increasingly developing as well as developed, these alternative measures to GDP. And as I said, child wellbeing, health, education and environmental sustainability are right up there with those measures. And the Australian National Development Index project, which Mike Salvaris and a group of us are setting up, includes Tim Costello, Gus Nossel again, who's just such a champion, is to develop for Australia a set of values which we would want to measure, and then that would guide public policy. And we're getting some traction. It's set at it's actually at Deakin University is its place, and we will be trying to get that as a national project up. But I think that I'm a great supporter of data. I think data is power, and knowledge, data and knowledge are power, but it's how you use them, and that's why I'm so committed to this OECD Global project. So I just want to acknowledge Tony. I think he's an absolute champion, and I don't know how he manages to keep going when you think of the people who take no notice of him. And the two postdocs, Jamie Yallop and Brad Ferrand, who is absolutely totally dedicated. Jamie has given up her job for a year, so if you want to give her some support. And she is running the 350.org campaign in Western Australia, and my long-suffering Christian Crozier, who does all my slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona. We've got about 5 to 7 minutes for questions, so if somebody would like to put their hand up, we might start with Joe. Oh, you probably need the mic, actually.
Yeah, I'm an increasingly deaf old granny, that's what I am too.
I'm a paediatrician in Gippsland. I'm just wondering if you could, well, firstly, do you think there'll be enough exposures of children and fetuses from the Morwell mine fire of 40 days? And how do we study it?
Well,
what do we tell the government to do?
Well, I mean, there's going to be effects of that, don't you think? I mean, we know there's going to be direct effects because of the air pollution. What we don't know is what the indirect effects are, how many fetuses were exposed and so on. But you do have very good record link data. Well, you potentially, in Victoria, get your bloody act together, guys, have got very good linked data. And what you should be doing, as we could do in Western Australia, is to track any area from birth records linked to birth defects, linked to hospitalisations, etc. You don't have to do a special cohort. I mean, that would be a waste of money, I think, to set up a special cohort just for the Morwell kids, yet another observational study. But what you could do is to look at these data sets, because all you'd really want to know for severe things would be how many kids were born. You'd need to have their dates and gestational ages, and how many kids were admitted to hospital, and how many kids had birth defects and so on. It probably isn't going to be numerically a good study, but at least you would be collecting that information, or at least analysing information that's actually collected. So I think that's a very good question.
Any other questions? Bob?
Thanks, Fiona. Magnificent as always.
No, you're the champion.
But Ross Garnaut gave us a little hope yesterday when he pointed out that you in Western Australia have the answers to the Senate by-election, and that he pointed out that the House has already repealed the various pieces of legislation that were starting to make some progress in Australia, and that the Senate's knocked it back, so that if we get a hostile Senate, there could be the trigger for a double dissolution, and we could have a climate election.
Yeah, we could.
So I wonder what you think about the chances of a positive Senate outcome in Western Australia in favour of climate legislation.
Well, I'm just hopeful, Bob. What I'm worried about is this stupid system of preferences, and I think that if Labor doesn't preference the Greens, they're nuts. So is Mark coming today, Butler? Yes, he is. Well, go for him. Absolutely go for him. Seriously, he's a very good man. He's a very good man. And if any of you know Bill Shorten, I know Bill well, I'm going to get on the blower to him too. It's absolutely crucial that not only Scott Ludlam gets in, but the preferences go to the Greens. It's about it really is about, I can't imagine a better scenario than the one you've just described. Because it is going to take political leadership, and we've got to have people power making that difference. They asked me to stand for the Senate election. I just couldn't go into politics at this stage of my life. But I mean, you know, if I'd probably 10 years ago, I probably would have considered it, you know. But it's such an important election, isn't it? Yeah.
We've got time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Go back.
I was reading Joe's would agree with you about GDP, and they
Well, yeah, well, Joe is the one who's actually got this, along with Enrico Giovannini, Joe Stiglitz, Nicholas Cern and Amartya Sen are the ones who are running the OECD Global Project.
And what I think is, do Doctors Save for the Environment have a stakeholder strategy to deal with, because many corporations are realising that a bad environment is actually bad for business in the long term. So there's a design problem that we need sustainable profit, and that it's the way we're profiting now is not sustainable.
Yeah, the short-termism, I think that's a very good point. I'm put that to the Doctors for the Environment. Is that, I mean, that's sort of what the 350.org divestment thing is about too, is actually making businesses realise that in fact there are alternatives. I mean, I don't know if Ross mentioned this, but I've got some data from the southwest of Western Australia, which Jamie and Brad gave me, which I was going to put about 25 more slides in, but I knew I would run out of time, that by 2024, the whole of the southwest of Western Australia could be completely fossil fuel free, using all the alternatives, and it would be a very good investment from companies to do that. It's a very good document, actually.
And the second thing is the big question in companies now is big data, and how would you use that? Because that's a huge focus.
Huge, yeah. We've had some fantastic conferences here in Melbourne, actually, on big data and how it can be used effectively. So I think that's a really good issue as well, really good question about how we would actually, and one of the things that I'm putting up to both this new federal government and the opposition is the idea that Bob Douglas has had for some time and that we've all had for some time. We're the only OECD country without a National Institute of Population Health and Wellbeing. And if you got the big data around such an initiative, which could be virtual like the Canadian models are, we would have one of the best capacities to look at big data and use it for public good and social well-being than any other place in the world if we wanted to. And we could use global data. So I think that it's a really exciting activity. I know there are big issues about big data and getting access to it and so on, but they can be overcome as we've overcome the record linkage problems in Western Australia and the privacy issues. And we can use it for public good. And I think, but we need a national organisation to run that. It's a very good question. Comment.
Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, due to time constraints. But I'm sure you all would like to join with me in appreciating Fiona for putting up her time, giving us such an inspiring talk. Thank you.